David Harris had just moved into his new home on Oak Lane, eager to start fresh in a peaceful suburban neighborhood. But his arrival, as the first black resident in a predominantly white community, would quickly unravel the quiet harmony of the street. What began as an accusation of suspicion soon escalated into a powerful lesson in racial bias, revealing the deep-seated assumptions people can hold. As David navigates this uncomfortable confrontation, he is given the chance to spark real change, not only in the hearts of his neighbors, but in the very way the community sees itself. This is a story about confronting prejudice, embracing transformation, and the courage it takes to build a more inclusive world. Now, let's begin. David stood on his front lawn, the late afternoon sun casting a warm glow over the freshly unpacked boxes around him. He had just moved into his new home on Oak Lane, a quiet, predominantly white neighborhood that felt like a fresh start. The air was crisp, the kind of fall evening that whispered of new beginnings, of potential. But as David carefully adjusted the last box of his kitchenware in place, he couldn't shake the feeling that his arrival had drawn attention. Not the kind he wanted. It started with a sound, a door creaking open across the street, then a shadow in the window. David had noticed it before, the faint twitch of curtains or the quick dart of someone retreating behind them. He had seen it in other places, in other towns, and it always carried the same sting, the sense of being watched. But he'd pushed it out of his mind. He was just settling in. He had every right to be here. But then the voice shattered the quiet. "I'm calling the cops on you." The words were sharp, cutting through the air like a knife. David looked up to see his new neighbor, a man in his mid-40s, standing on his porch with his fists clenched and his face flushed with fury. The man's finger was pointed straight at him, the accusation clear in his eyes. "You don't belong in this neighborhood," he continued, his voice shaking with indignation. The words hit harder than David expected. He had been mentally preparing for the inevitable glares, the whispered judgments, but this was different. David felt a flicker of frustration, but he quickly swallowed it down. Anger wasn't going to help him now. He needed to stay calm, stay composed. This man was already upset, already convinced that David was an intruder. And in his mind, David was about to become something even worse, a threat. David took a slow breath, willing his pulse to steady. He placed the box down gently, as though to show this man he wasn't in a rush to escalate the situation. The last thing he wanted was a confrontation. He had moved here for peace, for a chance at a new life. But now, with the man's words echoing in his mind, that peace felt fragile, easily shattered. "Sir," David began, his voice steady but measured, "I think there's been a misunderstanding." He offered a polite smile, hoping to calm the situation before it got any worse. "I just moved in. I'm your new neighbor." But before he could continue, the wail of approaching sirens reached his ears, the unmistakable sound of police cruisers cutting through the stillness of the afternoon. His stomach tightened. He knew that the man had already made the call. David could feel it in the air. The tension thickened, like a storm was about to break. David stood tall, straightening his posture, his back stiff with apprehension. He had been in situations like this before, in other cities, other neighborhoods. He knew the drill. The questioning looks, the doubt, the assumptions. He had learned over the years how to carry himself in moments like this. To remain calm, to stay composed, to not give anyone a reason to think he was anything less than the man he was. A hard-working individual, a law-abiding citizen. But still, as the police sirens grew louder, he couldn't shake the sense of unease gnawing at him. The cruiser pulled into the driveway across from his, its flashing lights illuminating the street in harsh reds and blues. The officers emerged, their faces hard to read, but their eyes scanning the scene with careful caution. David felt a familiar knot tighten in his chest as he watched them approach. He knew how this looked. The black man in the neighborhood, a new face in an unfamiliar place, with a neighbor who had already labeled him a threat. His mind raced. How would this go? Would they take the word of an angry neighbor over mine? Would I be the one questioned? Or worse, detained? He straightened up, took a deep breath, and forced his feet to move, stepping forward onto his porch as the officers made their way up his front yard. He'd been preparing for this moment. He had to, because he knew that for some people, his presence was automatically suspect. The officers were here, and soon they would see that he wasn't here to cause trouble. He wasn't here to stir up conflict. But even as David prepared himself, there was an unmistakable sense of foreboding in the air. The next few minutes could change everything. Could this be the moment where things would get worse? Where his hopes for a new start would be dashed by the weight of an accusation based solely on how he looked? The officers arrived, standing tall, their eyes cautiously assessing him. One of them, a taller man with salt and pepper hair, spoke first. "Good evening, sir. We received a call about suspicious activity. Mind if we ask you a few questions?" David's heart pounded in his chest, but his voice remained steady. "Of course, officers. How can I help you?" As the officers exchanged a quick glance, David noticed something. A sense of hesitation in their eyes. They weren't just reacting to the call. They were assessing him, probing for any sign that might confirm or disprove the accusation. He held his ground, maintaining his composure. Just as the tension reached its peak, a new voice broke through. It was loud and frantic, full of anxiety. David turned, already knowing who it was. It was Mark Edwards, the man who had called the police. Mark appeared at the edge of his yard, face flushed with panic. "That's him!" Mark yelled, pointing directly at David. "He doesn't belong here. He's the one who's been moving in all day. He's up to something." The words spilled out in a rush, filled with fear, filled with certainty. David felt the frustration rise in his chest, but he pushed it down. This wasn't the time for anger. It was time for clarity, for calm. "Sir," David called out to Mark, his voice firm but not unkind, "I understand your concern, but I assure you, I do live here. I'm your new neighbor." He paused, trying to convey the weight of the moment. "I'm not here to cause any trouble." But Mark didn't seem to hear him. His eyes were wide with panic, his finger still pointed accusingly at David. The officers exchanged another look, uncertain, caught in the middle. David knew what was coming next. He had been through this too many times before. He glanced at the officers, hoping they would listen, hoping they would see beyond the accusation, beyond the fear that had been planted by a neighbor too quick to judge. This moment, this small, seemingly insignificant moment, could either turn in his favor or spiral out of control. And then, just like that, everything would change. David had never been one to shy away from hard work. Moving into his new home on Oak Lane, he felt the quiet satisfaction of a dream realized. A home of his own, a place to build something new. As his sedan rumbled into the driveway, laden with boxes, he took a deep breath and looked around at the neighborhood. Oak Lane was exactly what he had imagined: neat, quiet, and peaceful. The homes were picture perfect, each yard meticulously manicured, with towering trees that lined the street like sentinels. It was the kind of place that people talked about with pride, a suburban oasis where everyone seemed to know each other's name and where the rhythm of life moved at a steady, predictable pace. But as David opened the trunk of his car and started unloading the first box, a sense of unease crept over him. The excitement of the move was still there, but it was tempered with a nervous awareness. He was one of the few black residents in this predominantly white neighborhood, and he knew that his presence would stand out. People might notice him. They might wonder who he was and what he was doing here. It was a familiar feeling, the sensation of being watched, scrutinized, the sense that people were sizing him up, placing him into a category before he had even spoken a word. He tried to push those thoughts aside, reminding himself that this was his moment. He had worked hard to get here. He deserved this house, this life. This was a new beginning, a chance to put down roots and make something lasting. As he bent to lift another box from the trunk, he caught a flicker of movement from the house across the street. Someone was watching him from the window, a shadow shifting behind the curtain. It was brief, so quick that David could barely make out the face. But the moment was enough. It was the kind of look he had gotten before. In other places, in other towns. The quick, curious glance, followed by the retreating figure, as though to confirm that he was indeed an outsider. David felt a pang of discomfort, but he pushed it away. "I'm just overthinking," he told himself. "I'm just the new guy." Everyone is curious when someone moves in. He had made up his mind that he wouldn't let that kind of scrutiny get to him. His job wasn't to live up to other people's expectations. It was to be himself. And he was determined to make a good impression. As the hours passed and he worked his way through the boxes, unloading the last of them into the house, he noticed a few other things. The subtle ways the neighbors watched from their windows, the quiet conversations that seemed to start and stop when he wasn't looking. It was a strange, unspoken tension that seemed to hang in the air. He could feel it, as though everyone was waiting for him to either confirm or dispel their assumptions. But David wasn't there to engage with the gossip or the looks. He was there to live his life, to build something for himself and for his future. Around late afternoon, as the last box was carried inside, he stood on the porch for a moment, taking it all in. Oak Lane was peaceful. The street was quiet, almost eerily so. It was the kind of place where people's lives played out behind closed doors, where everyone had their routines, their expectations. But David couldn't help feeling like an intruder, like a piece of the puzzle that didn't quite fit. He knew that it would take time for the neighbors to accept him, time for them to get to know him, and time for him to learn how to live here, to navigate this new space in a way that felt like home. His gaze swept across the street, past the manicured lawns and neatly trimmed hedges. He could see a few people walking dogs, a woman in her front yard tending to her garden. It was all so familiar, and yet so foreign to him. He could feel the weight of it, the weight of his difference, the quiet judgment, the invisible line that separated him from the others. But despite the disquiet that threatened to take root, he pressed on. This was his neighborhood now, and he was going to make it his own. David stepped inside, leaving the porch behind him. Tomorrow would bring the furniture truck, and with it, the next phase of his new life. He was ready. Ready for the work of truly making this place his home, ready to face whatever came next. But as the last light of day faded and the street settled into evening calm, David's mind wandered back to the neighborhood, to the faces he hadn't seen yet, to the questions he knew might rise. How would they receive him? Would they see past the color of his skin and understand that he, too, was just a man seeking a better life? Or would the quiet whispers that had already begun to form in the corners of Oak Lane grow louder, feeding off suspicion and uncertainty? The questions lingered, unanswered for now. But David knew one thing for sure. He was here, and he wasn't going anywhere. The house was his. The neighborhood was his. And he would do everything in his power to make sure that when the dust settled, when all was said and done, people would remember his name, not as an outsider, but as a neighbor. As David continued unloading box after box, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every movement felt exaggerated, as if the eyes of the entire street were trained on him, silently scrutinizing his every action. He'd always been a confident man, but something about this quiet suburban neighborhood made him feel out of place. It wasn't overt, at least not yet, but the weight of it was there, subtle but undeniable. As he moved the final few boxes from his sedan and made his way up the driveway, the odd sensation of being the center of attention deepened. It was as if, with each box he carried into the house, an invisible curtain was slowly being pulled back, revealing an audience just beyond his sight. Conversations would pause when he moved past a window, and he could feel the gaze of unseen eyes lingering on him, examining him through panes of glass. Even the dogs that had been trotting happily down the street seemed to give him an extra glance as they passed by, their owners glancing nervously at him before hastily pulling them along. David reminded himself to stay grounded. I belong here. I belong here just as much as anyone else, he repeated mentally, clinging to the conviction that he had earned this place. He had worked hard to get to this point, and there was no reason why he shouldn't enjoy the same peace and quiet that the rest of the residents did. This is my neighborhood now. This is my home. But still, the feeling lingered. By the time the last box was inside and the last of the day's light faded away, David stood on the porch, looking out over the street. The cool evening air settled over him, and for the first time he allowed himself a deep breath. The house was finally taking shape. The boxes, once filled with the clutter of his previous life, were now stacked neatly inside, ready to be unpacked and made into something new. He had done it. This was the beginning of his new chapter. The next day would bring the furniture truck, and that would feel like the true start of his new life. Yet as he stood there, surveying the quiet street, he had no idea that his arrival had caused a stir just next door. Inside the house next door, Tom Wilson paced anxiously back and forth, his mind racing. He had been watching David all afternoon, his thoughts churning as he tried to make sense of what he had seen. The man, this new neighbor, he didn't belong here. Not in Oak Lane. Not in a place like this. He was carrying boxes inside, sure, but there was something about him. Something that didn't quite fit. Tom had lived in this neighborhood for years, and in all that time, he had never seen anyone like David move in. Sure, new people came and went, but not like him. Tom's eyes narrowed as he peered through his blinds once again. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but the more he watched, the more uneasy he felt. David had been so calm, so nonchalant about everything, but Tom couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off. Something about him seemed wrong for this neighborhood. He couldn't ignore the discomfort that was rising inside him. And when he had seen David alone, without anyone to accompany him, it had made the hairs on the back of Tom's neck stand up. His heart raced as he finally picked up the phone, dialing the emergency number with urgency in his voice. "I'm calling the cops," he said, his hand trembling slightly as he spoke to the dispatcher. "There's a suspicious man in my neighbor's house. I think he might be breaking in." The operator's voice was calm and professional, but Tom could hear the skepticism creeping in. "Sir, can you tell me what makes you think there's a problem?" Tom paused, feeling his words falter in his throat. What was it that made him think this man was doing something wrong? He had seen David carrying boxes, but that didn't exactly make him a criminal. "Well, he's not from around here," Tom blurted out, his frustration beginning to bubble over. "He's been carrying boxes all afternoon. He doesn't look like he belongs." The operator didn't immediately respond. "Sir, can you be more specific? What makes you think he doesn't belong?" Tom's mind raced as he struggled to find the right words. He hadn't actually seen anything wrong. There were no signs of a break-in, no broken windows or doors. Nothing. But still, something didn't sit right. He just looks out of place. This is a quiet neighborhood. We don't get many new people moving in, especially not someone like him. The operator's tone grew more measured. "I understand your concern, sir, but moving into a neighborhood is not a crime. We need concrete reasons to dispatch officers. Has he done anything illegal or threatening?" Tom's frustration grew. He could see David calmly carrying yet another box inside, his movements slow and deliberate. No, there wasn't anything criminal about it. But there was something about David that unsettled him. Something that made him feel like he needed to act to make sure that everything was safe. "I don't know. It's just something about him. Please, just send someone for the safety of the neighborhood." There was a long pause before the operator sighed. "We take all calls seriously, sir, but without evidence of wrongdoing, we can't dispatch officers based on assumptions." Tom swallowed hard, staring out at the street. He could see David's silhouette moving around in the house, and it made him feel even more on edge. "Fine, but please, just send someone to check." The operator reluctantly agreed to send an officer, and as Tom hung up the phone, a mix of unease and strange relief washed over him. He watched as the sound of a siren echoed down the street, the flashing lights of a police cruiser soon visible in the distance. David stood still, his eyes catching the glimmer of the blue and red lights in the distance. A knot formed in his stomach as he straightened up, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He didn't know exactly what was coming, but he felt the undeniable certainty that his arrival had, somehow, set something in motion. The air felt heavy now, as if the very essence of the neighborhood was shifting around him. As the police cruiser rolled to a stop in front of his house, David could feel his heart race. The last box had been unpacked. Tomorrow would bring the furniture truck, and with it, the chance to finally feel at home. But for now, this moment, this encounter, was something he would have to face. And when the officers stepped out of the car, he knew this tension, this unease, wasn't going to just disappear. Inside the house next door, Mark Edwards paced nervously, his thoughts spinning as he looked out the window at David's home. The sight of the new neighbor, so calm, so poised, yet so undeniably out of place in his mind, had unsettled him more than he cared to admit. The quiet, picturesque suburb of Oak Lane had been his sanctuary for years. It was a place of order, a place where everyone knew their neighbors and things rarely changed. But now, everything felt different. David's arrival had disrupted the familiar rhythm of their neighborhood. Mark couldn't shake the unease that had settled in the pit of his stomach ever since he'd first laid eyes on the man. There was just something about him, something that didn't fit. It wasn't the fact that David was black. Mark couldn't fully admit to himself what it was, but it was how David moved, how he carried himself with a quiet confidence that made Mark feel small and unsure. He was from somewhere else. Mark was sure of it. He didn't belong here. He couldn't. Mark glanced out the window once more. David was still moving boxes, just like before, carrying them into the house with an ease that didn't match Mark's sense of growing discomfort. He shifted uneasily from one foot to the other, his eyes narrowing as he watched. Why hadn't anyone else noticed? Why hadn't anyone said anything? If David were truly one of them, one of the people who belonged in Oak Lane, why did Mark feel so wrong about this? Why did he feel this sickening sense of danger in his gut? Unable to shake his anxiety, Mark made a snap decision. He reached for the phone, his fingers trembling slightly as he dialed 911. His heart thudded in his chest as he waited for the call to connect. When the operator answered, her voice calm and professional, it felt like an anchor, something to latch onto amidst the whirlpool of his thoughts. "There's a suspicious man in my neighbor's house," Mark blurted, his words tumbling out in a rush. "He's been carrying boxes inside all afternoon. I think he might be breaking in." The operator's voice remained steady, but there was a hint of skepticism beneath her words. "Sir, can you explain to me what makes you think this person is suspicious?" Mark hesitated, feeling the weight of his own assumptions pressing down on him. He wasn't sure what to say. It wasn't as if David had done anything illegal. He'd simply been moving boxes into his house. But there was something about it that didn't sit right with Mark. He could feel his palms growing clammy as he tried to articulate what he was seeing. But the more he tried, the more it felt like his reasoning was slipping through his fingers. "He doesn't belong here," Mark finally said, the words coming out more forcefully than he intended. He heard the weakness in his own voice and instantly regretted it. What kind of excuse was that? The operator didn't respond right away. Instead, there was a pause, a subtle tension hanging between them. "Sir, I understand that you're concerned, but can you tell me what exactly about this person makes you think he's doing something wrong?" Mark's frustration mounted. The operator's questions felt like they were poking holes in his reasoning, but he couldn't stop himself from speaking. He just doesn't fit in. He's not like the others around here. The words tasted bitter in his mouth, but he pressed on. "I've lived in Oak Lane for over 10 years. We don't get many new people moving in, and when we do, they don't look like him." There was another pause on the other end of the line, and for a brief moment, Mark thought the operator might hang up on him, might tell him he was overreacting. But her voice remained calm, though with an edge of patience now. "Sir, moving into a new home is not a crime. Without evidence of wrongdoing, we cannot dispatch officers based on assumptions. Has he done anything threatening? Has he broken into a house or caused any kind of disturbance?" Mark felt his stomach churn. No, there hadn't been any actual signs of a break-in, and no, David hadn't done anything threatening. But that didn't change how Mark felt. The discomfort, the nagging sense that something wasn't right. It was all-consuming. I don't know, but something needs to be done. For the safety of the neighborhood, we can't just let someone like that move in and not question it. The operator's tone grew firmer, but still maintained its professional distance. "Sir, I understand your concern, but without concrete evidence of illegal activity, we cannot act on assumptions about who belongs where. If you don't have anything specific to report, then I advise against making a call based purely on your discomfort." Mark's pulse quickened. He could see David through the window now, carrying yet another box inside, his back turned, oblivious to the eyes watching him. What was it about this man that felt so foreign? So unsettling? Mark could feel his discomfort rising to a boiling point. He couldn't just sit by and do nothing. "Please," Mark pleaded, his voice growing more desperate. "Just send someone. Someone needs to check, for everyone's safety." After what seemed like an eternity, the operator sighed, the sound almost imperceptible over the line. All right, sir. I'll dispatch a unit to check on the situation. Please remain calm and don't take any further actions yourself. Mark felt a strange sense of relief, mixed with guilt. As he hung up the phone, he looked out the window, watching as the flashing lights of a police cruiser began to approach. His pulse raced in his chest. He hadn't been able to put his finger on what had bothered him about David, but he had acted, and now the wheels were in motion. The sirens grew louder as the cruiser slowed and came to a stop in front of David's house. Mark pressed his face against the window, watching intently as the officers stepped out of the car, their bodies tense and alert. In the distance, David was still moving around his house, seemingly unaware of the impending confrontation. He could sense the change in the air, the weight of it pressing in on him. Something was happening now, something beyond his control. And Mark, standing just beyond the blinds, watched as the drama began to unfold, his heart heavy with a mixture of unease and uncertainty. David had just set down a heavy box, wiping the sweat from his brow, when he noticed the bright, blinding flash of blue and red lights reflecting off the houses across the street. His heart skipped a beat. The sirens were distant but growing louder, and within moments, a police cruiser rolled up to the curb in front of his house. The sharp, jarring noise of the sirens made David's stomach sink. He knew, deep down, that this wasn't good. He had hoped that the move would be seamless, that he'd settle into this new home without any disruptions, but this was something he wasn't prepared for. It seemed inevitable that this would happen. His legs felt heavy as he stepped back from the porch, his mind racing. What had he done wrong? Nothing, of course. But that didn't seem to matter. He had no idea what would happen next, but he had to face it head on. Taking a deep breath, he braced himself, walking slowly to the edge of the porch to meet the officers who were already stepping out of their cruiser, their eyes scanning the area with professional detachment. Two officers approached, their postures alert and their faces tight with caution. There was no warmth in their demeanor, only the cool professionalism of people used to dealing with uncertainty. David couldn't help but feel that the weight of their gaze was different from the normal. Everyday attention he had received while moving in, this felt scrutinizing, like he was being sized up. "Good evening, sir," said the taller officer, his voice even but with a slight edge to it. His hand rested casually on his belt, but his eyes flicked back to David with an unreadable expression. "We received a call about suspicious activity. Mind if we ask you a few questions?" David took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. His heart raced, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had done nothing wrong, and he wasn't about to let fear or frustration cloud his actions. "Of course, officers. How can I help?" Before the officers could respond, Mark, the neighbor from next door, burst out of his house. His face was flushed with fear and indignation, and he pointed directly at David, his voice trembling. "That's him!" Mark shouted, his words full of urgency and panic. "He doesn't belong here." The accusation hit David like a punch to the gut. For a brief moment, his mind went blank. The frustration he'd been trying to hold in surged to the surface. But he controlled it. He couldn't let this escalate further. His gaze shifted to Mark, whose eyes were wide with panic, his finger still pointed accusingly at David, as though he were some kind of criminal. It was as if Mark's entire sense of reality had been built on the idea that David didn't belong in Oak Lane, simply because of who he was. David's voice was firm but steady. He didn't want to escalate this situation further, but at the same time, he had to make it clear that he wasn't going to be bullied or intimidated. "Sir, I understand your concern," he began, addressing Mark directly, "but I assure you, I live here. I'm your new neighbor." Mark recoiled at David's words, clearly stunned. His eyes flicked back and forth between David and the officers, as if he couldn't quite process the situation. His fear seemed to shift, turning into something else, embarrassment, perhaps, but it was quickly replaced by stubbornness. No, this doesn't make sense," Mark stammered, his voice rising with increasing anxiety. "You can't just move in here. This is a quiet, safe neighborhood. What are you doing here?" David fought the urge to raise his voice, to let the anger he felt spill out. But he kept his composure, his gaze meeting Mark's with calm intensity. He couldn't allow Mark's assumptions to define him. He was standing in his own front yard, in his own home, and he wasn't going to let anyone take that from him. I understand your surprise, sir, David said, his tone calm and measured. But I assure you, this is my house. I moved in today. I've just started unpacking. The officers, having observed the exchange, exchanged a glance. David could see the subtle shift in their expressions, the slight softening of their posture as they processed his words. They seemed to be unsure, caught between doing their duty and grappling with the growing realization that this wasn't a simple case of a suspicious person. The taller officer hesitated for a moment before speaking. "We'll need to verify this," he said, his voice flat. "Do you have any identification on you, sir?" David nodded, his hand slipping into his pocket as he pulled out his wallet, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He could feel his pulse quicken as he extracted his ID and handed it to the officer. The officer glanced at it, then looked up at David, his eyes widening as he took in the name. "Wait a minute," the officer murmured, scanning the ID again. You're Chief David Thompson?" David nodded, his lips curling into a small, weary smile. "That's right. I'm the new police chief for this district. I start officially next week, but I wanted to get settled in first." The realization hit the officer like a thunderclap, and he straightened immediately, his posture shifting from cautious to professional. The tension in the air dissipated slightly, but there was still an underlying awkwardness as the officer processed the turn of events. The other officer, who had been silent up until now, looked at David with a mixture of embarrassment and disbelief. Mark stood frozen, his face draining of color as the full weight of his actions began to sink in. He stammered, his words faltering as he tried to apologize. I'm so sorry, Chief. I didn't realize." David raised a hand, cutting him off gently. "It's all right, officers," he said, his voice steady and kind. "You were just doing your job. I understand, but I hope this serves as a reminder about the dangers of making assumptions based on appearances. It's a dangerous habit, one that can lead to misunderstandings." The officers nodded, their faces flushed with embarrassment as they silently processed the situation. Mark, on the other hand, looked like he wanted to disappear. The guilt in his eyes was palpable, and David could see the conflict within him. There was a long pause as everyone absorbed the gravity of the moment. David stood tall, his presence unwavering, but his heart felt heavy. This wasn't how he had imagined his first evening in the neighborhood going. But he knew, deep down, that this was a turning point. It was a moment that could spark change, and though it would take time, it was a start. The officers exchanged glances once more, their expressions shifting as they processed the new information. The taller officer still held David's ID in his hand, his eyes flicking between the card and David's calm, steady gaze. The seconds stretched out, thick with tension. It was clear that the officers were struggling to reconcile the man in front of them, David, a man who had just been accused of being suspicious, with the title now staring back at them from his ID. David could feel the subtle shift in the air as the realization began to settle in. This wasn't a simple case of mistaken identity anymore. This was something deeper, something much more uncomfortable. The truth hung in the air like an unspoken weight, and the officers now stood on the edge of understanding. David took a slow, deliberate breath, his chest tightening ever so slightly, but his composure never wavered. He knew that this moment was about more than just clearing his name. It was about making a point, one that wasn't just for Mark, but for everyone who lived in Oak Lane, and perhaps for the officers as well. The taller officer's eyes widened as he continued reading the ID, his hand trembling just slightly. His mouth opened, but no words came at first, as if he needed a moment to process what he had just read. Finally, his voice came out in a strained whisper. "Wait, you're Chief Harris?" He stammered the words, barely able to meet David's gaze. His face went pale as the magnitude of the situation dawned on him. David nodded slowly, a small but knowing smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "That's right," he said calmly. "I'm the new police chief for this district. I start next week, but I wanted to settle in first." His voice was steady, but there was an edge of something deeper beneath the surface. A quiet strength, perhaps, that came from knowing he had been wronged, yet refusing to let it derail him. The revelation hit Mark like a thunderclap. The words rang in his ears, and his face drained of all color, his jaw hanging open in disbelief. The man he had just accused, whom he had assumed didn't belong here, that he was some intruder or troublemaker, was not just another resident. He was the very person Mark had likely called on to help keep the peace. The weight of his own actions crashed over him in a flood, and his stomach churned with an uncomfortable mix of guilt and shame. For a long moment, Mark stood frozen, his gaze flicking back and forth between the officers and David, unable to process the enormity of his mistake. His mouth opened once, then twice, but no words emerged. David stood there, watching Mark, giving him the space to grapple with what had just happened. The officers seemed equally disoriented, their once firm composure faltering as they exchanged uncertain looks. The tension in the air was palpable, like a thick fog that had descended upon the street. They were all fully aware now that something had gone terribly wrong, that assumptions had been made, and that the repercussions of those assumptions were far more serious than anyone had anticipated. The officers shifted uncomfortably, the reality of their mistake settling heavily on their shoulders. They had come here expecting to deal with a simple case of suspicious activity, but instead, they were now face to face with a stark reminder of how fragile the trust between community members and law enforcement could be. The situation wasn't just a minor misunderstanding. It was a reflection of something much larger, something embedded in the very fabric of society. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the shorter officer spoke, his voice quieter than before, with a touch of embarrassment. We're sorry for the misunderstanding, sir," he said, his words measured and respectful, though they didn't quite erase the awkwardness of the moment. We didn't know who you were." His tone was conciliatory, but there was a certain hesitance, as if unsure whether this apology would be enough to make up for the error. David nodded, acknowledging the officer's words, but knowing that apologies wouldn't erase the underlying issue. He understood that they were simply doing their jobs, but the discomfort that lingered was not just from their actions. It was also from the assumptions that had been made about him the moment he had walked into the neighborhood. He could see the change in the officers, the realization dawning on them that they had allowed their own biases to cloud their judgment. But David didn't let it linger. He didn't let this moment define the rest of their encounter. Instead, he turned his gaze toward Mark, who still stood frozen on his front lawn. Mark's expression was a mix of horror and regret, his eyes locked onto the ground as though trying to avoid the weight of the situation. It was clear that the man was struggling with his own feelings of shame. David took a deep breath and took a step forward, his voice calm but firm. "It's all right," he said, his tone softening. "You were just doing what you thought was right. But I think we can all agree that jumping to conclusions is never the right course of action." His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of experience. David knew that he wasn't just talking to Mark anymore. He was speaking to everyone who had been involved in this moment, the officers, the neighbors, the community as a whole. Mark finally spoke, his voice low and strained. "I had no idea," he admitted, the words almost choking him. I thought." He trailed off, unable to finish his sentence. He simply didn't have the words to make sense of his actions. David, sensing the man's turmoil, gave him a slight nod. "It's okay. We all make mistakes. The important thing is to learn from them and move forward." There was no bitterness in his words, only an understanding that could only come from someone who had experienced their own share of difficult lessons. The officers were silent now, their posture more relaxed, but the awkwardness still lingered in the air. Mark slowly began to step back, his gaze never leaving David's, and David could see the regret in his eyes. For all his flaws, Mark was at least acknowledging the error and the harm it had caused. That, in itself, was a small step toward progress. David nodded to the officers one last time, his face hardening slightly as he prepared to return to his home. "I'll leave you to your duties," he said with a slight, respectful smile. "Thank you for coming out." As David turned to walk back up his porch steps, he could feel the weight of the situation beginning to lift, slowly, almost imperceptibly. This was just the beginning. The neighborhood, the officers, Mark, they would all have to reckon with the consequences of their actions. But for David, there was a quiet resolve inside him. He had not come here to be just another resident. He had come here to make a difference, even if it meant confronting uncomfortable truths along the way. As he closed the door behind him, he allowed himself a moment of silence. Tomorrow was a new day, and with it came new challenges. But in that moment, he knew he had already begun to change the course of his future here on Oak Lane. David stood there for a moment, letting the silence stretch around him. The officers had left, their cruiser fading into the night, but the weight of the moment still hung in the air. Neighbors had begun to gather on their lawns, standing at a distance but clearly watching, some with curiosity, others with uncertainty. David could feel their eyes on him, but this time it was different. The tension had shifted, and he knew what he had to do. He turned toward them, his expression steady and resolute, but beneath the surface, his heart was racing. This wasn't just about clearing his name or asserting his position. This was a moment to address something far deeper, something that had been building long before he set foot on Oak Lane. The feeling of being watched, of being judged before he even had a chance to prove who he was, had followed him for most of his life. And now, standing here in front of these neighbors, some of whom had been quick to make assumptions, he realized he had the chance to help them understand. "I understand this isn't the introduction any of us expected," David began, his voice clear but unyielding. His eyes scanned the small crowd before him, some familiar faces, others still strangers, and he saw the range of expressions. Discomfort, curiosity, even a hint of embarrassment from a few. He could sense that they were all trying to reconcile what they had seen and heard. For many, it was likely the first time they had seen a person of his position and of his race caught up in something so jarring. He knew this was an opportunity, but it would require more than just explaining the situation. It would require a message that cut through the discomfort and addressed the issue at its core. David took another steadying breath and continued. "I know that for some of you, seeing me, someone who doesn't look like the rest of the people who live here, might have been unsettling. I get it. We live in a world where people like me are often seen as threats, even when we've done nothing to deserve that." His voice remained even, but there was a quiet strength in his words. The message he was delivering wasn't just for Mark or the officers. It was for everyone standing here, for every neighbor who had watched from behind a curtain or from a distance. "I've spent much of my life being looked at with suspicion, being judged before I had the chance to speak or to prove myself," David said, his voice growing softer, more reflective. It's a kind of constant vigilance where you can never fully relax because you know that the moment someone lays eyes on you, they might see something other than who you are. It's exhausting to live like that every day, but that's the reality for a lot of us. And tonight, it was my turn to face it again. A hushed murmur spread through the crowd, and David could tell that his words were starting to sink in. The neighbors who had been standing apart were now inching closer, drawn in by his honesty and the vulnerability he had allowed to show through. Some lowered their eyes, perhaps in guilt, while others met his gaze, their faces thoughtful. David paused for a moment, letting the silence linger as he gathered his thoughts, choosing his words carefully. You see, it's not just about one person or one incident. It's about all of us, living together in a community. We have to be willing to see one another, not through the lens of fear or assumption, but as neighbors. We have to create a place where everyone, no matter who they are or where they come from, feels safe, where everyone feels valued for what they bring to the table, not judged for how they look or what we think they might be. His words were slow but deliberate, each one landing with intention. He could see the way people were listening now, leaning in, absorbing what he was saying. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about something larger, something that was at the heart of why he had chosen this neighborhood in the first place. Oak Lane, with its manicured lawns and pristine homes, was supposed to be a place of peace, of unity. But tonight had revealed a crack in that foundation, a crack that could only be mended with understanding, with growth. Racial profiling, or any form of bias, isn't just a problem for people like me. It's a problem for all of us, David said, his voice growing more resolute. When we let assumptions guide us, we miss the opportunity to truly see who someone is. We miss the chance to make a connection, to build trust. And without that trust, we can never build a real community. The crowd stood still, the tension slowly beginning to melt into something more reflective. David could see a few neighbors exchanging glances, perhaps questioning their own actions, perhaps realizing the truth behind his words. There were no dramatic gestures, no angry outbursts, just a quiet understanding beginning to settle in the air, like the first stirrings of change. David stepped forward, the gesture gentle but intentional, as though reaching out to bridge the distance between them. I didn't come here to be a symbol or a lesson. I came here to be a neighbor, to live among you all and share in this community. But if we're going to make that work, we have to do it together. We have to acknowledge the biases that exist, the things we don't always see because we've never been forced to face them. But we also have to take action to change them. He glanced around the circle, meeting the eyes of several neighbors. Some were nodding now, others still uncertain, but there was an openness that hadn't been there before. This can be a place where people of all backgrounds feel at home, but it requires more than just tolerance. It requires understanding. It requires effort. David paused, the gravity of his words settling in the air between them. I don't expect things to change overnight. It's going to take time. But I'm here, and I'm willing to work with all of you to make sure that Oak Lane becomes the kind of place where everyone feels safe, where no one is ever looked at with suspicion just because they don't fit the mold. For a long moment, the crowd stood silent, and David could almost feel the shift in the atmosphere. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't resolved. But in that moment, it felt like a beginning of a conversation that needed to happen, of a foundation being laid that could, over time, transform Oak Lane into something better. A place where every neighbor, no matter their skin color, their history, or their story, could truly belong. David turned and walked slowly back to his house, the soft murmur of voices behind him rising as the neighbors began to talk among themselves. He didn't look back, but he could feel the change in the air. Tomorrow would be another day, another step forward. But for now, he knew that this was enough. He had made his point, and the work had only just begun. David stood there for a moment, his hand extended toward Mark Edwards, the weight of the offer hanging between them. He had laid the groundwork for understanding, spoken of the shared responsibility they all had in making Oak Lane a place of safety, inclusion, and trust. But now, this was the real test, the moment where words could either sink into the silence or spark the change David had been hoping for. Mr. Edwards, David said again, his voice calm but firm, I'd like you to be part of the solution. Your perspective is valuable in making this neighborhood safer for everyone. It's easy to point out the problems, but it takes real courage to step forward and be part of the change. David's words hung in the air as Mark hesitated, his eyes darting between David's outstretched hand and the faces of the neighbors gathered around them. The tension in the crowd was palpable, as though everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see how Mark would respond. For a long moment, Mark stood frozen, his brows furrowed in thought. The encounter had shaken him in ways he hadn't expected. What had begun as an instinctual fear of the unknown, of someone who didn't look like him, had now turned into something more complex. He had seen the determination in David's eyes, the calm strength he had carried through the entire ordeal. And for the first time that evening, Mark found himself questioning the assumptions he had held so tightly to. David's outstretched hand remained, a silent offer of peace, of progress, a chance to move beyond the tension and make a real difference. Mark felt the weight of his own discomfort, the internal struggle that tugged at him. His first instinct was to retreat, to brush it off and find some way to justify his actions. But as he looked around, he saw the faces of his neighbors. Some looked at him with hope in their eyes, while others, still wary, seemed to be waiting for him to take responsibility. David was right. This wasn't just about him. It was about the community, about the work they all needed to do together. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Mark took a slow step forward. The crowd seemed to exhale collectively, and David's hand remained steady, unwavering. Without a word, Mark reached out and shook it. The handshake was brief, almost too quick to register, but it carried an undeniable weight. It wasn't just a gesture of politeness. It was a small but significant step towards understanding, towards change. The tension that had gripped the neighborhood for the past few hours seemed to dissolve in that one simple moment. David gave Mark a nod of acknowledgement, a silent recognition of the effort it took to extend that hand, to take the first step towards reconciliation. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice carrying the sincerity of the moment. "This is how we begin to make things better, for all of us." As the crowd began to disperse, the sense of unease still lingered, but now there was something new in the air: possibility. David knew that the work was far from over. One handshake wouldn't solve everything, but it was a start of a new chapter for Oak Lane, one where understanding replaced fear, and where the differences that once divided them could be the very thing that brought them together. Mark lingered a moment longer, still processing the encounter, but when he finally turned to head back to his house, he did so with a different energy. There was no more anger in his posture, no more defensiveness in his step. Instead, there was a quiet acknowledgement of the shift that had occurred. A shift that began with David's willingness to speak out, to share his truth, and to call for something better. As the night stretched on and the neighbors returned to their homes, David stood on his porch, watching the neighborhood slowly return to its quiet rhythm. He knew that tomorrow would bring more conversations, more work, and more challenges. But in that moment, as the soft glow of streetlights bathed Oak Lane, he allowed himself a moment of hope. This was a neighborhood, yes, but it could also be something more. It could be a community where people weren't defined by their differences, but by their willingness to understand one another. And with that thought, David turned toward his new home, knowing that the road ahead would require patience, resilience, and a lot of hard work. But for the first time since his arrival, he felt ready. Ready to be part of the change Oak Lane so desperately needed. As he closed the door behind him, the faint sound of voices still murmured in the distance, a quiet undercurrent of the transformation that was just beginning. The days following the confrontation had been a whirlwind of emotions, but David could feel the momentum of change starting to take root in Oak Lane. It was as if the incident had cracked open a door that many had been too hesitant to approach, and now, slowly, people were stepping through. Conversations about race, about bias, and about community were happening more frequently, in hushed tones between neighbors, in louder discussions at local cafes, and even during chance encounters at the grocery store. David knew that this was just the beginning, but it was a beginning nonetheless. The ripple effect of his encounter with Mark Edwards had reached far beyond their front lawns. News of the new police chief living on Oak Lane had spread quickly, and his handling of the situation with Mark had sparked curiosity, along with a measure of hope, in a place that had long prided itself on its homogeneity. Some neighbors, especially those who had been silent observers up until that point, found themselves reflecting on their own biases and assumptions. They had witnessed firsthand how fear and misunderstanding could take root in even the most ordinary interactions. And now they were ready to do something about it. David had been proactive in fostering these conversations, hosting informal meetups and town halls that encouraged open dialogue. What had once been a relatively quiet neighborhood where people kept to themselves had become a place where voices were now being heard, sometimes for the first time. David's role as the incoming police chief added weight to his words. He wasn't just a new neighbor. He was someone who could make a tangible difference, someone who had the power to change the dynamics within the precinct and the entire community. But change, he knew, would not come easily or quickly. Within the precinct, David faced his own set of challenges. Some of the officers embraced his vision for a more inclusive, community-driven approach to policing. They appreciated his candor, his willingness to address uncomfortable truths, and his determination to break down the barriers between law enforcement and the community. However, not all were on board. A significant number of officers resented the shift in direction, viewing it as an attack on the way things had always been. They were set in their ways, and the idea of embracing the nuanced complexities of racial issues felt threatening. Some whispered behind closed doors, questioning his decisions, his motives. But David had prepared himself for this. He knew that transformation was never a straight path, and resistance was a natural part of the process. To bridge these divides, David held one-on-one conversations with officers, allowing space for them to voice their concerns and fears. He didn't try to placate them, but instead offered them a chance to reconsider their assumptions, to challenge the ingrained patterns of behavior that often led to friction with the community. It wasn't an overnight shift, but little by little, David began to see cracks in the resistance, moments where even the most skeptical officers were beginning to see the value in his approach. He knew that the journey toward a more just and compassionate police force would take time, but he was willing to walk that road, even if it meant facing discomfort along the way. Back in the neighborhood, the community meetings, once sparsely attended and often dominated by a few outspoken voices, were now drawing large crowds. People came not just to complain about issues, but to learn, to engage, and to be part of the solution. They discussed ways to improve the neighborhood's safety, but also ways to make it more welcoming, inclusive, and diverse. David helped to facilitate these conversations, encouraging people to see one another not just as neighbors, but as partners in a collective vision. His approach was always measured, always thoughtful, and he made sure every voice was heard, even the dissenting ones. There were tense moments, disagreements, and clashes of ideology, but through it all, the focus remained on finding common ground. Even Mark Edwards, who had once been so opposed to the idea of change, had found himself reluctantly involved. He joined the newly formed Community Advisory Board, a group that met monthly to discuss issues of race, policing, and public safety. Mark's involvement had been slow. His initial participation was hesitant, and his contribution was minimal. But over time, he began to speak up more, sharing his thoughts on how to bridge the divides that had once seemed insurmountable. David noticed the change in Mark, the gradual softening of his stance as he engaged more deeply with the people he had once viewed with suspicion. The process was slow. David knew that. He saw the uncertainty in some of the older residents' eyes, the wariness of those who had been here for decades, unsure of what this new era would bring. He could feel their resistance, but he also sensed their curiosity, their willingness to give him a chance. Every small victory, every smile exchanged, every handshake, every open conversation felt like a triumph. It was these moments that kept him going when the work felt overwhelming, when the hurdles seemed insurmountable. These were the moments that reminded him why he had chosen this path, why he had decided to plant roots in a place that was still so unfamiliar to him. And so, David continued. Every day, he worked to plant seeds of change, even if it meant pushing against the current. He understood that transformation wasn't just about policies and programs. It was about the people, the relationships, and the willingness to face uncomfortable truths. The road to change would be long, and there would undoubtedly be setbacks. But David was patient. He had come to understand that true change wasn't a singular moment, but a series of small moments, woven together by a collective commitment to doing better, to being better. As the weeks turned into months, David watched Oak Lane transform before his eyes. It wasn't perfect, not by a long shot, but it was evolving, and that gave him hope. People were learning to see each other beyond their differences, to listen with open hearts and minds. And David, standing on the porch of his home, watching the neighborhood continue to grow, knew that this was only the beginning. There was still so much work to be done. But the road to transformation was no longer a distant dream. It was a reality that he and the community were building together, one step at a time. As the last traces of daylight faded, David sat alone on his porch, his hands resting on the armrests of the old rocking chair, his gaze drifting over the street. The hum of evening settled around him, the gentle rustle of leaves in the trees, the faint sound of children's laughter echoing from a distant backyard, the quiet pulse of a community slowly becoming more than the sum of its parts. The streetlights flickered on, casting their soft glow over Oak Lane. And David felt the weight of everything that had transpired, the challenges, the confrontations, the small victories. For a moment, everything felt still, peaceful. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, and allowed himself a rare moment of quiet. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, about how he had stood on the other side of this street not long ago, unsure of what he would find, unsure of what he could change. His mind wandered back to the day of the confrontation with Mark Edwards, when everything seemed to hang in the balance, when the weight of suspicion had threatened to pull him under. And yet, here he was, in this moment of calm, a part of this community in a way he hadn't expected. The road hadn't been easy. There had been moments of doubt, of frustration, of anger. There had been days when he wondered if all the work, all the effort, was worth it. But as he looked at the faces of his neighbors, some he had come to know, others still strangers, David knew that it had been. Because the real work wasn't in the grand gestures, the speeches, or the decisions made behind closed doors. It was in the quiet, everyday moments when people reached out, when they took the time to listen, to understand, to change. The work was in the handshake offered with hesitation, the conversations that started awkwardly but grew into something meaningful, the small shifts in perspective that quietly but steadily altered the course of Oak Lane. His thoughts returned to the challenges that still lay ahead. Change, David knew, wasn't a destination. It was an ongoing journey. It would require more conversations, more patience, more courage from everyone involved. There would be moments of regression, times when old habits reasserted themselves, when fear and suspicion resurfaced. He couldn't promise that every problem would be solved, that every person would embrace the vision of a more inclusive and just community. But he could promise this: he would keep showing up. Every day, he would keep showing up. He would lead by example, not through perfection, but through persistence, through the commitment to doing better, even when it was difficult. David stood, stretching out his legs, feeling the soft evening breeze against his skin. He had made a life for himself here, and he was ready for whatever came next. The road ahead wasn't always clear, but it was a road he would walk with purpose, knowing that each step forward, no matter how small, was a step towards something better. He glanced across the street, where Mark Edwards was standing in his yard, his back turned, but his posture more relaxed than it had been months ago. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was progress. And that, David knew, was the essence of any meaningful change. Progress, no matter how incremental, was still progress. The stars began to twinkle above, bright against the darkening sky, and David took one last deep breath, his heart filled with a quiet resolve. He knew that the work would never truly be finished, that there would always be challenges to face, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace. He had planted the seeds of change, and now it was up to the community to water them, to nurture them into something strong and lasting. David smiled, turning away from the porch to head inside. Tomorrow, there would be more conversations to have, more meetings to attend, more work to do. But for tonight, as he walked through the door of his home and closed it softly behind him, he allowed himself to simply feel the weight of the progress that had already been made. He was part of something bigger now, a community that was learning to grow together into something better. And that, David thought, was a victory worth celebrating. And so, David's journey on Oak Lane was just the beginning of a larger transformation. Through his courage, understanding, and dedication to change, the community began to grow, learning to embrace difference and create a space where everyone could feel safe and valued. Thank you for watching. If you found this story inspiring, please like, share, and leave a comment below to let us know your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss more powerful stories like this one. Together, we can make a difference, one story at a time.